Innistrad was a great magic block and is well remembered for its gothic horror theme, as well as the many powerful and memorable cards it contributed to the game. But Innistrad also was the beginning of something worse, a harbinger of the degeneration of the game that was to occur slowly over the coming years. The first set to pander to a particular genre so strongly, save for maybe Arabian Nights or perhaps Ice Age, but Innistrad was the first to so strongly adhere to tropes, something that long-time players noticed as soon as it released. Innistrad on its own was not bad, nor was Theros that came after. But the early signs of the abomination the game would become was evidence. Vague references to the Kafka story Metamorphosis are present in Delver of Secrets. 12 years later, we have references to every single horror movie from the 1980s in Duskmourn. And this is because magic is no longer capable of creating its own tropes, and instead must parasitize upon existing ones. It must reference these aspects of other stories and even the real world, so that people's brains will get a shot of dopamine when they realize the connection, when they quote-unquote get the joke. That is what is now present, as a substitute for actual identity for something unique to the game itself. Magic is no longer capable of that, as their creative staff have degraded. Some will blame diversity hires, but that is not truly what is to blame. What is to blame is the consumerist mindset of Marvel Funko Pop purchasing soy freaks who are still playing. The type of stories they are used to are full of quips and are mishmashes of so many disparate creative visions that the resulting mess is a tantalizing swarm of color that ultimately means nothing, reminiscent of the frosted Fruit Loops cereal they likely still eat for breakfast at the age of 34. These pudgy, dysgenic potheads care only for the jolt they get from reference humor. A magic card is like seeing a funny meme, and it's one that they can collect. They preach about media literacy, yet utterly lack it themselves. Their souls are utterly dead, and thus an original high-concept fantasy setting like Mirrodin or Lorwyn is wasted on them. Instead, everything must remind them of a thing they already know: cyberpunk Japan, ancient Greece, Leheckan epic Vikings, 1920s New York City, and Christ knows what else. Bloomborough was guilty of the same pandering, but at least that was to something related to fantasy. And to bring it back to Innistrad, this was where the game began to diverge from wholly original settings, ones that could not be described as simply as a single genre, and began to pigeonhole themselves into something snappy and fast to recognize as a marketing technique. Mirrodin, a world made of metal. That is simple to describe, yet evokes such mystery. Innistrad, a gothic horror world. There are still questions, but fewer. Look at Duskmourn, a 1980s horror movie trope fest. Any questions you would have, you probably don't want to know the answer to. But it's important to remember that it began with Innistrad. Everyone who had played since before then noticed the shift. Of course, at the time, we lamented the addition of vampires, as Twilight was popular at the time, and we loathed the idea of vampires who sparkled. Zombies, werewolves, it all seemed so contrived. If only we'd known what lay ahead just a couple years later with Theros. Another block that wasn't bad, in fact was quite good. But its success seemed to give Wizards of the Coast license to shameless base their new planes, not on high concepts, but on low concepts. Fantasy Egypt, Fantasy Japan. Kamigawa did it first, to be fair, but it was widely panned, and it makes a good point to bring up Kamigawa, because it was an isolated incident, like Arabian Nights, which is so far back as to be unfair to even discuss, as the game was brand new and still finding its footing. An occasional set based on a real-world culture is fine. But when it is so blatant, so artless, and when the places referenced no longer have anything to do with the classic fantasy genre that Magic the Gathering is meant to belong to, it becomes clear that there is great brain drain at Wizards of the Coast. They even made a Cowboys and Indians set, but minus the Indians so as to satisfy their social justice warrior design staff, along with the kinds of pathetic fucks on Twitter who whine about whether it should be called tribal or typal. They have sunk so low that Murder Mystery Dinner, Wild West, 1980s horror are all they can think of. They are rapid-fire marketing room designs. And while it is a far, far cry from what Magic was a decade ago, it is important to remember that it started with Innistrad. As great a set as it is, recognizing this helps you to understand how we got here and how we could undo this travesty that has happened to our beloved game. If not for the hordes of bearded, soy-addled, pudgy subhumans who will buy it anyway.